The road stretched endlessly into the night, swallowed by the relentless storm. Snow pounded against the windshield, the cold creeping in like an unshakable shadow. Jake gripped the wheel, exhausted but determined to finish his route. Then he saw it. A shape, barely visible in the swirling snow. A dog, frozen and unmoving, lying in the middle of the road. Was it too late? Was there anything left to save? What Jake did next, no one could have predicted. The highway stretched endlessly into the darkness, swallowed by the merciless storm. Snow fell in thick sheets, covering the desolate road in a silent, white abyss. The wipers of the 18-wheeler struggled against the icy wind, barely keeping the windshield clear. Inside the cab, Jake Carter gripped the wheel, his knuckles white with tension. A seasoned truck driver in his mid-40s, Jake had spent most of his life behind the wheel, crisscrossing the country, delivering goods from one state to another. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years of sleepless nights and long-haul drives. His short-cropped brown hair was streaked with early greys, and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow clung to his jaw. His deep-set blue eyes, once filled with youthful determination, now carried the weight of exhaustion and solitude. Tonight was supposed to be just another routine trip. He was hauling a load of frozen produce, goods that couldn't afford delays. He had to reach the next city's distribution center before dawn. If he failed, the produce would spoil, the company would lose money, and worse, his job would be on the line. The CB radio crackled to life. "Jake, where the hell are you?" The voice of his boss, Frank Delaney, burst through the static. Frank was a no-nonsense man in his 50s, a former trucker himself before moving to management. He had a raspy, impatient voice, one that Jake had grown used to over the years. Jake sighed and picked up the receiver. "I'm on Route 89, pushing through the storm. Roads are bad." "I don't give a damn about the storm. That shipment is time-sensitive. If you're late, don't bother coming back." Jake clenched his jaw. Frank had always been ruthless, prioritizing profit over anything else. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 1:42 a.m. If he kept going at this pace, he'd barely make it in time. He exhaled sharply, replacing the receiver. Just another job, just another night. Then he saw it. At first it was just a shadow, barely discernible against the endless white, but as his headlights pierced through the thick snowfall, the shape became clearer. A dog, a golden retriever, lying motionless in the middle of the road. Jake's heart kicked against his ribs. His instincts screamed at him to swerve, but he held firm, gripping the wheel with controlled precision. Slamming on the brakes on an icy road was suicide. Instead, he downshifted, easing the truck to a slow, careful stop, just feet away from the unmoving animal. The world outside was deafeningly silent. Jake sat in his seat for a long moment, his breath fogging up the windshield. The dog wasn't moving. Snowflakes had settled on its golden fur, now clumped and matted with frost. It looked like it had been lying there for hours, maybe longer. It was dead. It had to be. Jake exhaled and reached for the gear shift. He didn't have time for this. He had a job to do. But then he saw it. A single breath, faint, shallow. But there. Jake's stomach twisted. It was alive. Barely. For a moment he hesitated. Logic told him to drive on. The storm was getting worse. His deadline was closing in, and he had already stopped for too long. This wasn't his problem. But another part of him, the part buried beneath years of hardened cynicism, told him he couldn't just leave it there. Damn it. With a grunt, he pulled on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and shoved the door open. A gust of freezing wind slammed into him, cutting through his thick jacket like knives. He trudged forward, his boots sinking into the fresh snow, each step crunching underfoot. Kneeling beside the dog, he ran his gloved hand over its frozen fur. It was a female, middle-aged, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Her breathing was weak, her body stiff from the cold. Her paws were raw and cracked, suggesting she had been wandering for days. But what troubled Jake most was her weight. She was far too thin, malnourished. And yet even in her fragile state she tried to move. Her body trembled weakly, as if instinct alone was willing her to survive. Jake felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. He had seen plenty of stray animals in his years of driving, but none quite like this. There was something different about her, something in the way she still fought, even on the edge of death. He glanced up at the storm around him. The temperature was dropping fast. She wouldn't last another hour. His radio crackled again. "Jake, I swear to God, if you're stopping for gas or some stupid crap." Jake ignored it. His fingers hovered over the dog's side. He could pick her up, carry her to the warmth of his cab, and try to get her to safety. But doing so would cost him time. Time he didn't have. His options weighed heavily in his mind. Option 1, get back in the truck and drive away. Pretend he never saw her. Option 2, take her with him and risk missing the delivery, possibly losing his job. Both choices had consequences. Jake clenched his jaw. He had made tough calls before, but this was different. The wind howled, the road stretched on, and the clock kept ticking. Jake stood there, staring down at the fragile life at his feet, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do. The wind howled like a restless spirit, wrapping its icy fingers around Jake as he stood motionless in the snow, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His breath curled in front of his face, vanishing into the night as he stared at the fragile creature before him. The golden retriever let out a weak, pitiful whimper, barely able to lift her head. Her golden fur, once undoubtedly beautiful, was matted and stiff with ice, her ribs faintly visible beneath the weight of the snow that clung to her frail frame. She had been fighting to survive in this merciless cold, yet she had collapsed here, in the middle of the road, as if this was the end of her journey. Jake let out a slow, heavy breath, rubbing his gloved hands together before kneeling beside her. His boots crunched against the frozen pavement, the weight of his body pressing down into the snow. He hesitated for only a second before reaching forward, his fingers pressing gently against her chest. There it was, weak but steady, a heartbeat, a flicker of life. His mind screamed at him to walk away. You don't have time for this. But his gut told him another story. With a grunt, he shrugged off the nagging voice of reason and pulled off his heavy coat, wrapping it tightly around the dog before scooping her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body shivering violently against him, her breath warm but faint against his sleeve. The cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she barely reacted to the movement. How long had she been out here alone? Jake trudged back toward his truck, his boots sinking into the thick snow. The storm had worsened, the wind roaring louder, and the headlights of his rig barely illuminated the swirling frost in front of him. He yanked the door open, climbed in, and quickly set the trembling dog onto the passenger seat, grabbing an old fleece blanket from behind his seat and wrapping it around her. The cab was warm, at least compared to the frozen wasteland outside. He turned up the heat, rubbing his hands together before gently stroking the dog's fur, helping the warmth seep back into her body. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the ice began to melt from her golden coat, revealing a deep, honey-colored fur beneath the frost. Jake noticed something else, a collar, worn and cracked with age but still intact. His fingers brushed against the faded leather, turning it slightly to check for a tag. Nothing. No name, no number. Just an old, weathered strap that told him one thing. She had belonged to someone once. His heart twisted in an unfamiliar way. He had seen plenty of strays on the road before, feral, abandoned, lost. But this dog had history. Someone had cared for her, at least at one point. But if that was true, why was she here, starving, frozen, left for dead? The radio crackled, snapping Jake from his thoughts. "Jake, where the hell are you?" Frank, again. Jake groaned and grabbed the receiver. "I ran into something on the road," he muttered. "Something? The only thing you should be running into is the goddamn warehouse. Do you know what time it is? That shipment can't wait." Jake clenched his jaw. He looked at the dog, still trembling, her breath shallow. "I had a delay." "A delay? That load is worth more than your paycheck. You miss that deadline, you might as well not come back." Jake's grip on the radio tightened. He had worked for Frank for years. The man was tough, a former trucker himself, someone who had made his living on the road before climbing the corporate ladder. He knew the business better than anyone, but he didn't care about people, or animals for that matter. Jake could feel his pulse in his ears. He needed this job. It wasn't just a paycheck, it was his way of surviving, of keeping himself moving forward, away from the ghosts of his past. But sitting next to him, wrapped in a blanket, was a life hanging by a thread, and somehow, for the first time in a long time, he couldn't turn away. "I'll handle it," Jake said flatly before cutting the radio off. Silence filled the cab, save for the hum of the engine and the muffled wind outside. He ran a hand down his face, sighing deeply. Then something caught his eye. Through the windshield, illuminated by the dim glow of his headlights, he saw faint tracks leading into the woods, small, uneven imprints in the snow. Too small to be a grown dog. His stomach twisted. Puppies. His gaze snapped back to the retriever. A mother. She's a mother. The realization sent a shiver through him, not from the cold, but from the weight of what it meant. She hadn't been wandering alone. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, there were more lives at stake. Jake inhaled sharply, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The rational part of him screamed to ignore it. He had already done enough. He had the mother. She was alive, and he could get her to safety. He didn't owe anyone or anything more than that. But the father in him, the one he had tried to bury, the one that had died with his family, knew better. If there were pups out there, they wouldn't survive the night. Jake cast one last glance at the retriever, whose eyes had barely flickered open. She wasn't strong enough to go back for them. If they were going to make it, he was their only chance. With a frustrated groan, he shoved the door open, letting the icy wind lash against his skin once more. The storm raged. The darkness stretched ahead of him, and deep in the woods, something small and helpless was waiting. Jake had never been one to believe in fate, but tonight, standing on the edge of the unknown, he felt something pulling him forward. And so he took a step into the snow. The cold had a way of numbing the senses, making even the sharpest instincts sluggish. Jake could feel it creeping into his bones as he trudged forward, each step sinking into the thick snow. The wind lashed against his face, cutting through his jacket and chilling him to the core. His boots left deep impressions behind him, but ahead, barely visible under the soft glow of his flashlight, were the small, uneven tracks leading deeper into the woods. He followed them, his breath heavy in the silence of the storm. The mother he had found was barely clinging to life, and now he knew she wasn't alone. Somewhere in this frozen wasteland, her puppies were waiting for a mother who could no longer reach them. Jake wasn't a man given to hesitation, but tonight was different. He had spent years making quick, decisive choices behind the wheel, instincts sharpened by the need for survival. But now he felt the weight of every second ticking away, knowing that whatever he found at the end of these tracks might not still be alive. He pressed on, the crunch of snow beneath his feet the only sound in the stillness. His breath fogged in the air, his heart pounding against his ribs. Then the tracks stopped. Jake lifted the flashlight, scanning the area, his stomach knotting with dread. There, nestled beneath the twisted roots of a fallen tree, two small shapes trembled in the snow. They were barely more than 6 weeks old, their fur golden like their mother's but damp with ice. Their tiny bodies curled against each other for warmth, their eyes wide and glassy with exhaustion and fear. One of them, the smaller of the two, lifted its head weakly, ears twitching at the sound of Jake's approach. The other barely moved. They were so small, so fragile, their thin frames telling a story of days spent without enough food. Jake knelt down carefully, reaching out to them. The smaller pup gave a soft whimper, a tiny plea for warmth, for help. The other remained still, its breath so faint, Jake feared he was already too late. His hands, rough and calloused from years of hard labor, had never held something so delicate. He scooped them up, cradling their trembling forms against his chest, feeling the weak heat of their tiny bodies through his jacket. The weight of them in his arms, so impossibly light, sent a wave of something through him that he hadn't felt in years, a familiar ache, a memory of something long buried. Jake had never been a man to dwell on the past. He had learned long ago that looking back only made it harder to move forward. But holding these puppies, their fragile lives hanging in the balance, something deep inside him cracked open. For a fleeting moment, he saw another small shape in his arms, smelled the faint scent of baby shampoo, felt the tiny fingers grasping onto his thumb. The memory was sharp and sudden, tearing through him like the wind outside. He could almost hear the laughter, the soft coos of a child in the back of his truck, the echoes of a life that had been stolen from him far too soon. Jake blinked hard, forcing the memory back. Not now. The puppies whimpered again, snapping him back to reality. He had no time for ghosts. Adjusting his grip, he turned and began the trek back to the truck. The storm had thickened, the snow coming down in relentless waves. The cold burned against his skin, but he held the puppies close, shielding them as best he could. Every step felt heavier, every second stretched thin by the gnawing fear that he was already too late. By the time he reached the truck, his chest was tight with exertion, his fingers numb from the cold. He yanked open the door, climbing inside with a controlled urgency, and immediately his heart sank. The mother hadn't moved. She lay exactly where he had left her, still wrapped in the fleece blanket, but her breathing was even shallower now, her body completely limp. Her eyes, barely open before, had shut completely. The slow rise and fall of her ribs was almost imperceptible. Jake's throat tightened. Damn it! He set the puppies down gently, their small bodies curling up beside their mother's, seeking warmth she was barely able to give. His mind raced. He needed to move. Now. The nearest vet clinic was at least 40 miles away, and in this weather, it would take him over an hour to get there. An hour might as well have been a lifetime for animals this week. His grip tightened around the steering wheel, his pulse pounding in his ears. The radio crackled again. "Jake, where the hell are you? Answer me, damn it!" Frank's voice grated through the cab, sharp and impatient. Jake barely glanced at the radio, the shipment, the deadline, the job. He swallowed hard, staring at the road ahead. He knew what he had to do. Jake wasn't a saint. He had never been the kind of man who made sacrifices for others, at least not anymore. But tonight, he had a choice. And for the first time in a long time, it was a choice he didn't hesitate to make. With a grim set to his jaw, he shifted the truck into gear, not toward the warehouse, but toward the distant glow of a town that held the only chance these dogs had left. As the truck rumbled forward into the storm, Jake didn't look back. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural growl against the howling wind. The truck's headlights cut through the thick curtain of snow, illuminating the desolate road ahead. Jake's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Every instinct in his body told him this was a bad idea. Driving into a worsening blizzard, no clear path, no communication with the outside world. But when he glanced at the 3 fragile lives curled up in the passenger seat, barely holding on, he knew there was no choice left to make. The mother lay motionless, her breaths thin and shallow, barely visible beneath the heavy fleece blanket Jake had wrapped around her. The 2 puppies nestled against her side, their tiny bodies quivering, their golden fur still damp with melted ice. The cab was warm, but it wasn't enough. They needed medical attention, fast. Jake's gut twisted as he pressed the accelerator. He was at least an hour from town under normal conditions, but this wasn't normal. The blizzard had thickened, turning the road into an unmarked wasteland of white. Even the dashed lane markers had disappeared beneath the fresh snow, leaving nothing but an endless stretch of uncertainty ahead. He knew these roads well, had driven them more times than he could count, but tonight they felt foreign, like a place he had never been before. He checked his phone. No signal, no GPS, no way to call ahead and warn the vet that he was coming. If they were closed, if no one was there. He exhaled sharply, forcing the thought away. One problem at a time. First, he had to get there. A gust of wind slammed into the side of the truck, making the entire cab shudder. Jake tightened his grip, adjusting his speed, careful not to lose control. He had driven through his share of bad weather, but this was different. This was the kind of storm that swallowed vehicles whole, left drivers stranded in ditches, waiting for help that might never come. He reached for the radio, hesitated, then pressed the button. "This is Carter, truck number 785. Anyone out there?" Static. He tried again. "I need a status on road conditions. Anyone got eyes on Route 89? More static. Then, faintly, a garbled voice breaking through the white noise. "Carter, storm, shut down, dangerous." The signal cut in and out, but Jake caught enough to piece it together. The roads ahead were bad, maybe impassable. His stomach sank. Turning back wasn't an option. Not anymore. He stole another glance at the mother dog. She wasn't moving. The puppies were still trembling, their small bodies pressed close to her as if they could somehow keep her warm. They had minutes, maybe an hour, before it was too late. He cursed under his breath. Faster! The truck groaned as he pushed it harder, the heavy tires cutting through the snow with difficulty. His wipers struggled against the thickening frost on the windshield. The heater blasted at full power, but even inside the cab, the air felt heavy with impending loss. Then, out of the swirling chaos, a figure appeared ahead. Jake's heart slammed into his ribs. For a split second, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. A dark shape, barely visible through the snow, standing in the middle of the road. Too small to be another vehicle. Too large to be an animal. A person. He hit the brakes, tires skidding against the ice, the truck lurching forward dangerously before grinding to a stop, just feet from the figure. His pulse pounded as he leaned forward, squinting through the storm. It was a woman. She stood wrapped in a thick winter coat, a scarf pulled high over her face, shielding herself from the brutal wind. She was tall, slender, but sturdy, with sharp, intelligent eyes peering out from under the hood of her coat. Even through the storm, Jake could see the lines of exhaustion on her face, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something worn into her over time. She raised a hand, knocking against the passenger side window. Jake hesitated for half a second before unlocking the door. The woman pulled it open, stepping up into the cab, slamming the door shut behind her, bringing a rush of icy air with her. She yanked down her scarf, revealing high cheekbones, flushed red from the cold, and lips set in a firm, no-nonsense line. "Jesus, you're lucky I saw you," she said, shaking snow from her hood. Her voice was low, steady, a voice that had given orders before and expected them to be followed. "Road's a mess ahead. You're not going to make it through if you don't know the way." Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Great. Exactly what I needed to hear." She frowned, eyes flickering to the blanket-covered shape in the passenger seat. Then she noticed the tiny, trembling forms nestled beside it. Her expression softened, not much, but enough. "You a rescue worker?" she asked. "No," Jake muttered. "Just in the wrong place at the wrong time." The woman studied him, then turned her attention back to the road. "You heading to town?" "Vet clinic." She nodded once, decisive. "Then you need to turn off the main road. There's an old service route a few miles up. Shorter, but dangerous in a storm like this. Still better odds than getting stuck on 89. Jake studied her, weighing his options. "You a local?" "Veterinarian," she said simply. Then, as if she had just realized who he was, she added, Sarah Whitmore." Something in Jake's chest loosened slightly. He had heard of Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a well-respected vet who had taken over the town's only animal clinic after her father passed away. Tough, no nonsense, dedicated. He'd never met her in person, but he'd heard truckers mention her now and then, about how she never turned an animal away, even when the owners couldn't pay. "Looks like you're exactly who I need," he admitted. Sarah didn't waste time with small talk. She reached forward, carefully pulling the blanket back just enough to check the mother dog's breathing. Her jaw tightened. "She's critical," she said bluntly. "Pups are hypothermic. You were right to rush." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Can you save them?" Sarah met his gaze, her dark eyes unreadable. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I sure as hell am going to try." She pointed toward the road. "Take the next left. I'll guide you from here." Jake nodded, shifting gears. The truck roared back to life, barreling forward into the snowstorm, now with a new sense of purpose. 3 lives hung in the balance, and Jake wasn't losing them tonight. The truck rumbled through the storm, its headlights barely cutting through the thick veil of snow. Jake's hands were locked onto the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, his breath slow and measured, but inside he was anything but calm. The road was treacherous, the visibility near zero, but he followed Sarah Whitmore's sharp, precise directions without hesitation. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her dark eyes locked on the road ahead, her face illuminated in fleeting flashes by the dashboard's glow. She had the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but commanded it nonetheless. A quiet, unwavering confidence born from years of experience. She was in her late 40s, her high cheekbones framed by strands of dark brown hair escaping from beneath the thick hood of her coat. Her skin was weathered not from vanity but from years of working long hours, often outdoors, often alone. There was a time when she might have been considered striking, but now she wore exhaustion like an old friend, the kind that never left her side. She had inherited the town's only veterinary clinic from her father, Dr. Whitmore, a man known for his stubborn kindness and relentless dedication to saving animals, no matter the cost. Sarah had learned everything from him, including the hard truth that sometimes, no matter how much you fought, you couldn't save them all. That lesson had come at a price. Years ago she had lost a case, a dog brought in too late, too far gone. The owner had begged her to do something, anything, but there had been nothing left to do. She still carried the weight of that failure, no matter how many lives she had saved since. Maybe that was why she didn't hesitate when she saw Jake's truck through the storm. Maybe that was why she was here now. The veterinary clinic finally came into view, a modest, single-story building, its front lights flickering in the storm, the familiar blue cross logo above the entrance barely visible beneath the swirling snow. Jake barely let the truck roll to a stop before shoving the door open, moving fast despite the exhaustion clawing at his limbs. He didn't feel the cold anymore, didn't feel the way his clothes clung to his skin, still damp from the snow. All he could think about were the 3 fragile lives in his cab. Sarah was already moving, her sharp voice cutting through the wind. "We need to get them inside, now." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He carefully lifted the mother dog, still wrapped in the fleece blanket, her body limp in his arms. Her breathing was even fainter now, her ribs barely rising and falling. The 2 puppies whimpered softly as he scooped them into his other arm, their tiny bodies curling against him, desperate for warmth. The clinic's doors swung open before they even reached them. A younger man stood there, rubbing sleep from his eyes, already pulling on a lab coat over a faded sweatshirt. Nathan Reyes. In his early 30s, Nathan was Sarah's assistant, a former city vet who had traded high-paying hospital work for something quieter, something real. He was of mixed Hispanic descent, with dark curls, warm brown eyes, and an easy-going nature that contrasted sharply with Sarah's no-nonsense attitude. But tonight there was no room for ease. The moment he saw the dogs in Jake's arms, his exhaustion vanished. "Get them to the back," Nathan ordered, stepping aside. Jake followed Sarah down the hall, past the reception area and into the treatment room, where a stainless steel table sat in the center, surrounded by shelves of medical equipment, emergency blankets, and IV stands. Sarah snapped into action, pulling on gloves as she nodded to Nathan. "Set up a warm IV. We need fluids fast." Jake laid the mother dog on the table, stepping back as Sarah and Nathan worked. His heart pounded. He had never felt this helpless before. Sarah placed her stethoscope against the mother dog's chest, her expression unreadable. "She's in bad shape. Hypothermia, dehydration, severe malnourishment." She looked at the puppies, curled up on the nearby counter in a thick towel. "They're weak, but they have a better chance." Jake swallowed. "Can you save her?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She adjusted the IV, hooking up fluids, working with a speed and precision that spoke of years of experience. But there was something in her eyes, something uncertain. "She's a fighter," she finally said, "but it's going to be close." Jake exhaled slowly. He had expected that answer, but it didn't make hearing it any easier. Nathan moved to check on the puppies, carefully examining them. "They're cold, but their vitals are better than I expected. If they made it this far, they're tough little things." Jake ran a hand down his face. He had done all he could. Now it was out of his hands. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, stretching them into something agonizing. He could feel his phone vibrating in his pocket. Frank, his boss, calling again. He didn't even look at it. For the first time in years, his job wasn't the most important thing in his life. He sank into a chair in the corner of the room, his muscles aching, his head pounding. He watched as Sarah worked, watched as Nathan checked the puppies, watched as the storm howled outside. The clinic smelled like antiseptic, like fresh hay and clean fur, like something comforting and familiar. It had been years since Jake had been in a place like this, years since he had felt like he belonged anywhere. The thought startled him. He had never planned on stopping in this town, never planned on anything beyond the next delivery, the next paycheck. But here he was, in a small veterinary clinic, in the middle of nowhere, watching over 3 dogs that weren't his, listening to the quiet hum of machines, keeping a fragile life from slipping away. Somewhere in the haze of exhaustion, he drifted into something close to sleep. The morning light was barely creeping through the frosted windows when he heard footsteps approaching. Jake blinked awake, his body protesting as he sat up, his muscles stiff from sleeping in the chair. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. But she was smiling, just barely. "She made it," she said simply. Jake stared at her for a long moment, his brain sluggish, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. Then the words registered. The mother dog had survived. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, running a hand over his face, feeling something tight in his chest loosen. Sarah stepped aside, nodding toward the table. The mother dog was still weak, but her breathing was steadier, her fur fluffed out slightly with warmth. One of the puppies had curled up beside her, their tiny bodies rising and falling in unison. Jake hadn't believed in miracles for a long time, but maybe, just maybe, this was one. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, something he barely recognized anymore. Hope. The clinic was quiet in the early morning, the faint hum of the heater the only sound filling the air. Outside, the blizzard had finally begun to ease, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white. The roads would still be dangerous, the snow piled high against the sidewalks. But for the first time in hours, the world outside seemed still. Inside, however, Jake found himself restless. He sat on the floor of the treatment room, his back against the cabinets, his long legs stretched out in front of him. The 2 golden retriever puppies had finally stopped trembling and were now curled up in his lap, their small bodies pressed against the warmth of his flannel shirt. They had settled quickly once they realized they were safe, and despite everything they had been through, their tiny tails had even managed a few weak wags. The mother dog, now stable but still weak, rested on a soft pad nearby, her chest rising and falling steadily. Jake had spent most of the night watching over her, half expecting her to slip away, despite Sarah's reassurances. But she had survived. She was stronger than she looked. Nathan entered the room, yawning and rubbing his eyes, still dressed in the same hoodie and jeans from the night before. The younger vet tech was usually relaxed, but exhaustion had put a sharper edge to his movements. He carried a tablet in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other, offering Jake a nod of acknowledgement before lowering himself onto the stool by the counter. "We scanned her for a chip," Nathan said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. He set the tablet down on his knee and took a slow sip of coffee. "Got a hit." Jake stiffened, his fingers unconsciously tightening around the puppies in his lap. "She had an owner." Nathan nodded, tapping at the screen. "Yeah. Looks like she was registered under the name Maggie about 3 years ago. Belonged to a family that used to live a few towns over." A strange sensation curled in Jake's chest. Maggie. He hadn't let himself think about what her name might be. Hadn't thought about the fact that she had once belonged to someone, that she had once been loved. He glanced at her sleeping form, her golden fur finally beginning to shine under the clinic lights, now that it was no longer caked in ice. Sarah walked in then, still as sharp and focused as she had been hours ago, though the lines under her eyes were deeper. She crossed her arms over her chest, watching the dog for a moment before speaking. "We contacted the number listed on her records. Someone picked up." Jake's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure why he felt uneasy. Maybe it was the idea of her being taken away, or maybe it was the thought that someone out there had let her go. Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "They don't want her back." Silence stretched between them. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Just like that." Nathan glanced down at his tablet, reading off the notes he had taken from the call. "They said she ran off during a bad storm last year. They searched for her for a while, but then they moved. New city, new job, new house. They said they couldn't take on a dog again right now." His lips twisted slightly at that. Jake's jaw clenched. He looked at Maggie again, at the scars barely hidden beneath her thick fur, at the way her ribs were still faintly visible from weeks, maybe months, of malnutrition. She had been out there alone for a long time. Sarah sighed, rolling her shoulders as she leaned against the counter. "People lose pets, it happens. But there's a difference between losing one and deciding not to look." Jake knew what she meant. A part of him had expected, hoped, that someone would be relieved to know she was alive, that someone would come rushing to take her home, but the truth was far uglier than that. She had been forgotten, left behind, and now she had nowhere to go. Nathan set the tablet down with a soft thud. "If they're officially surrendering her, we can put her up for adoption. The clinic has connections with a few good rescues." Jake didn't respond. The idea of sending Maggie and her pups to a shelter, of letting them be passed from place to place, waiting for someone to take a chance on them, it didn't sit right. He had seen too many strays wandering truck stops, too many dogs left behind in parking lots and rest areas, too many reminders of what happens when people decide that animals are disposable. Sarah was watching him closely now, something knowing in her gaze. Jake shifted, his fingers moving gently over the soft fur of the puppies still resting against him. One of them stirred, its tiny mouth opening in a quiet yawn before nuzzling closer. For years, Jake had been alone, by choice. He had built his life around constant movement, around long, empty roads and solitary nights in the cab of his truck. He hadn't needed anyone, hadn't wanted anyone, but now, in the stillness of this clinic, with 3 lives depending on him, something had changed. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "What happens if no one adopts them?" Nathan gave him a small shrug. "We keep looking until someone does." Jake nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back to Maggie. She had survived against impossible odds, had fought through the bitter cold, had protected her puppies even when she had nothing left to give, and now it was his turn. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "What are you thinking, Carter?" Jake let out a slow breath. He didn't have an answer, not one he was ready to say out loud. Instead, he ran a hand down Maggie's fur, his fingers brushing gently over her side. The puppies wiggled closer to his chest, their tiny forms settling against him. And for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel completely alone. He didn't know what was next, didn't know what kind of life he could offer them, didn't know if he was even capable of being what they needed. But for the first time, he was willing to try. The clinic was quiet, save for the occasional hum of equipment and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the dogs beside him. Jake sat in the same chair he had occupied all night, elbows resting on his knees, gaze fixed on the floor. His fingers traced absent patterns against his jeans, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts he couldn't quite make sense of. It had been a long time since he had felt this uncertain, since he had felt anything at all. Maggie lay curled on the padded bed in the corner, her golden fur now clean, free of the ice and dirt that had clung to her for who knows how long. Her breathing had steadied, her ribs no longer straining with every inhale. And though she was still weak, her presence filled the room with something Jake couldn't name. The two puppies were nestled against her, warm and safe for the first time in their short lives. They had no idea how close they had come to losing everything. Jake exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. His truck was still parked outside, half buried in snow, the engine cold after a night of neglect. Somewhere in that truck was a phone filled with missed calls from Frank, his boss, his meal ticket, the one thing keeping him on the road and out of places like this. If he called now, if he offered some excuse, maybe he could still keep the job. Maybe. But as he looked at Maggie, her tired amber eyes watching him from across the room, he felt something shift inside him. Could he really walk away from them? He had spent years telling himself he didn't need anyone, that it was easier to be alone, to keep moving, to never stay in one place long enough to get attached. The road had been his constant companion, a never-ending stretch of asphalt that required nothing from him but his attention and his time. It was predictable, safe. But now he wasn't so sure. Nathan entered the room, stretching his arms over his head, his dark curls messier than they had been the night before. He had clearly just woken up, the remnants of sleep still clinging to him, but his easygoing nature remained the same. "You look like a man trying to figure out how deep he's gotten himself," Nathan mused, leaning against the counter. Jake snorted, shaking his head. "That obvious?" Nathan shrugged. "Most guys don't spend the night in a vet clinic unless they're waiting on news. You already got the news, and yet here you are." He nodded toward the golden retrievers. "Thinking about keeping them?" Jake hesitated. He hadn't said the words out loud yet, hadn't even let himself entertain the idea fully. But wasn't that exactly what he had been doing since he found them? Nathan didn't push. He just sipped from a coffee mug, waiting. Jake ran a hand through his short hair, exhaling. "I don't know what I'm thinking." Nathan smirked. "That's a first." Jake let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "I'm a truck driver, man. I live on the road. I don't have a house. I don't have a backyard. These dogs need more than someone who's gone all the time." Nathan considered that for a moment, then set his mug down. "You ever think that maybe they don't care about that? That maybe what they need isn't a house, but someone who actually gives a damn about them?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't have to. Nathan gave him a knowing look before clapping him on the shoulder. "Think about it." And Jake did. He thought about it while watching the sunrise spill golden light through the clinic windows, warming the cold edges of the world outside. He thought about it while Maggie shifted on her bed, lifting her head slightly, eyes searching until they landed on him, as if she had been looking for him. And when his phone rang again, he didn't hesitate this time. He pulled it from his pocket, stared at the screen. Frank. The call had barely rung twice before he answered. "Where the hell have you been?" Frank barked, his voice all gravel and impatience. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in? That shipment was worth thousands and you just disappeared. You better have one hell of an excuse, Carter." Jake glanced at the dogs, at the way the puppies had curled up close, utterly trusting that they were safe, that they weren't going to be left behind again. "I'm done, Frank," Jake said simply. Silence. Then, "What?" "I'm done," Jake repeated. "I'm not coming back." Frank sputtered on the other end, caught completely off guard. "Jake, don't be an idiot. You can't just— What the hell are you even going to do?" Jake didn't have a solid answer to that yet, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of not knowing. "I'll figure it out," he said. Frank was still shouting when Jake pulled the phone away from his ear and ended the call. For the first time in years, he felt light. He turned back to Maggie, moving toward her slowly before lowering himself to the floor beside her. She didn't flinch, didn't try to move away. Instead, she let out a soft breath and rested her head against his knee. Jake ran a hand through her fur, letting himself really feel it, the warmth, the weight, the quiet trust in the way she stayed close. "Guess that makes it official," he muttered. Maggie thumped her tail weakly against the floor. Nathan reappeared in the doorway, Sarah at his side. She raised an eyebrow. "So?" Jake exhaled. "Guess I'm taking them home." Sarah nodded, as if she had known the answer before he did. "Good choice." Jake wasn't sure if it was a good choice. He wasn't sure what the hell he was doing, or if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But as he loaded the dogs into his truck, as he watched them settle into the passenger seat, curling up like they belonged there, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't just driving to another job, he was driving home. The road home stretched out before him, no longer just a highway but a path leading somewhere that actually mattered. Snow-covered pines lined the route, their branches bending under the weight of winter, the sky a soft, pale grey in the early morning light. The storm had passed, leaving a world blanketed in quiet, untouched white. Jake's hands rested firmly on the wheel, the engine of his truck humming beneath him, but for the first time in years, there was no rush, no schedule to keep, no deadline clawing at the back of his mind. This time, he wasn't just driving to get away, he was driving home. The 3 golden retrievers lay curled in the passenger seat beside him, their breathing slow and even. Maggie, the mother, had recovered remarkably well in just the last few hours, though she still carried a weariness in her frame, her ribs slightly too sharp beneath her golden coat. She was strong, though, Jake could tell, the way she curled protectively around her 2 pups, the way her eyes stayed on him whenever he moved, as if she was trying to understand the man who had saved her. The puppies, both barely 6 weeks old, had begun to show more of their personalities now that they were safe. One was slightly larger than the other, a bold little thing who had already started trying to clamber over the seat, ears flopping as he wiggled forward in curiosity. His coat was a shade darker than his siblings', his paws oversized for his small frame. He would be a big one someday, full of energy and mischief. The smaller pup was different, softer, quieter. He clung closer to Maggie, his little tail wagging hesitantly whenever Jake looked at him, as if he wanted to trust but wasn't quite sure yet. His fur was lighter, almost creamy in color, and his eyes were the same deep brown as his mother's, warm, thoughtful, carrying something that made Jake wonder if dogs, too, could hold memories of a past they didn't understand. As the truck rumbled down the narrow road leading to his home, Jake felt a strange tightness in his chest. He hadn't been back here in over a year, maybe longer. The house had become nothing more than a resting place between jobs, a reminder of a life he had lost. It came into view slowly, nestled between towering evergreens, a modest cabin of weathered wood and a slanted roof dusted with fresh snow. The porch sagged slightly from years of neglect, but the large windows still caught the morning light, glowing faintly against the cold. It was small, but solid, built with his own hands. It had once been filled with laughter, with warmth, with the sound of tiny feet running across the wooden floors. Now it was quiet. Jake pulled the truck to a stop, letting the engine idle as he took a long breath. He wasn't sure what he had expected to feel. Regret, grief, the familiar, suffocating weight of memories best left untouched. Instead, he felt possibility. He pushed open the door, stepping into the crisp morning air. The dogs stirred as the cold hit them, Maggie lifting her head, her eyes tracking his movements. The puppies wiggled awake, yawning tiny, high-pitched yawns as they stretched their small limbs. Jake reached in, scooping the pups into his arms. They squirmed, but he held them close, their warmth seeping through his flannel jacket as he carried them toward the porch. Maggie followed, moving stiffly, but with purpose, her paws leaving small prints in the fresh snow. Inside, the house was exactly as he had left it, silent, still, frozen in time. A worn leather couch sat near the fireplace, the wooden floors carrying the faint scent of pine, and something old, something lived in. Dust motes floated in the soft light filtering through the windows, untouched since the last time he had been here. He set the puppies down gently, watching as they sniffed at the unfamiliar space, their tails wagging cautiously. Maggie stepped in behind them, her nose twitching as she took in the scent of her new home. Jake moved on instinct, kneeling beside the old stone fireplace. His hands knew the motions well, stacking logs, striking a match, coaxing the flame to life. Soon, warmth began to creep into the room, the fire crackling softly, casting golden light against the walls. The puppies tumbled toward it immediately, curling up on the old woven rug, their small bodies finally at peace. Maggie followed, lowering herself beside them, her eyes drifting closed as the warmth lulled her into rest. Jake stood there for a long moment, just watching them. For years this house had felt empty. Now it was full. Something loosened in his chest. That night, for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming. The days that followed were quiet, but not lonely. Jake fell into a routine he hadn't even realized he missed, waking early, chopping wood for the fireplace, learning what it meant to share his space again. The dogs became his shadow, following him everywhere, their paws clicking against the wooden floors. Maggie, despite her past, adjusted quickly. She seemed to trust him now, moving easily around the cabin, curling up beside him in the evenings as if she had always belonged there. The larger puppy, who Jake had started calling Bear, was fearless, bounding through the snow with reckless enthusiasm, chasing after falling leaves, barking at his own shadow. He was the troublemaker, always getting into something, always making Jake laugh despite himself. The smaller pup, Whiskey, as Jake had started calling him, was different. Quiet, observant, always a few steps behind his brother, always watching. But he was the first to climb into Jake's lap when the evenings grew cold, pressing close without hesitation, as if he had already decided that this was where he belonged. Jake found himself talking to them more than he expected, not just commands, not just words of praise, but real conversations. He told them about the first time he had built this cabin, about the nights spent under the stars, about the people he had lost, the things he had run from, and somehow it didn't feel strange. He even found work nearby, a steady job at a local supply warehouse, something simple, something that let him come home every night. The first time he drove back after a shift, parking his truck in the driveway, he was met with 3 eager faces at the window, tails wagging wildly. Jake had never thought much about what home meant. Now he understood. The first real snowfall came a week later. The storm had been brief, leaving the world fresh and white, the air crisp and biting. Jake stood outside, hands in his pockets, watching as Bear and Whiskey barreled through the snowdrifts, their fur dusted in white, their laughter-like barks echoing through the trees. Maggie watched from the porch, her golden coat gleaming in the morning sun, her eyes bright in a way that made Jake's chest ache. Then, as if some unspoken agreement had been made, she stood and trotted toward him, pressing her head against his leg. Jake looked down, running a hand through her fur. "Guess we're doing this, huh?" Maggie wagged her tail, pressing closer. Jake exhaled, looking at the life around him, the snow, the dogs, the quiet peace of a place that finally felt like his again. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking for the next highway, the next destination, the next way to outrun his past. For the first time in years, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. A journey had ended, but another had just begun. The streets of Riverbend were quiet. Too quiet. 9-year-old Emma Carter clutched her grocery bag, unaware that danger lurked just around the corner. But Titan, her loyal Belgian Malinois, sensed it first. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the silence, and within seconds she was surrounded. 5 men, leather jackets, cold, predatory eyes. And then the leader stepped forward, a cruel smirk on his face. He had no idea that the family pet standing between him and the girl was no ordinary dog. What happens next will leave you speechless. The streets of Riverbend stretched quiet and empty under the fading glow of the sunset. Once a peaceful town, it now carried an unshakable tension. Doors locked early, neighbors glanced over their shoulders, and the sound of distant motorcycles had become a warning rather than background noise. The Blood Vultures, a ruthless biker gang, had taken root, and fear followed them wherever they rode. Emma Carter, just 9 years old, didn't fully understand the weight of Riverbend's problems, but she felt them. She saw the way her father, David Carter, came home later than usual, the lines on his face deepening each night. She noticed how store owners locked their doors before sundown, and how the friendly greetings of neighbors had turned into hurried nods. Yet tonight, Emma walked the streets alone. She wasn't afraid, though, not with Titan by her side. Titan, a Belgian Malinois, moved beside her like a silent guardian. His sleek, tan coat was marked by black accents around his muzzle and ears, and his sharp amber eyes scanned every shadow with precision. He was no ordinary dog. Once a SWAT K9, Titan had served beside his handler John Lewis until tragedy struck. A raid gone wrong, a handler lost, and a dog who refused to leave his fallen partner's side. Titan had been labelled damaged after that night. His behaviour unpredictable, his attachment to John too strong to transfer to another officer. He had been deemed unfit for duty. The department had planned to retire him permanently, maybe even euthanize him, until David Carter stepped in. David saw something in Titan that others overlooked. He understood loss, knew the pain of watching someone fall and being unable to save them. And so Titan came home with him, to Emma. Now Titan was more than a protector. He was family. Emma clutched her grocery bag tightly, her fingers curling around the thin plastic as she turned down Sycamore Lane, the shortcut home. The alley was dimly lit, a narrow passage tucked between old brick buildings, but Emma had taken this route many times before. Titan's ears twitched. He heard it before she did, a low, distant rumble, the sound of approaching motorcycles. Titan's steps slowed, his body shifting slightly in front of Emma, blocking her path with a firm but subtle movement. She frowned, sensing his change in posture. Then she heard it too, the roar of engines, the growl of metal and fuel. Her stomach tightened. From around the corner, 3 motorcycles emerged. Their chrome frames gleamed under the flickering streetlights, the thunder of their engines reverberating off the alley walls. Emma took a step back, gripping Titan's fur instinctively. Then the riders stopped. Engines idled. The heavy scent of exhaust filled the air. Slowly the men dismounted, their movements deliberate. They wore black leather jackets, each marked with the Blood Vulture's insignia, a crimson vulture perched over a cracked skull. Titan's posture shifted immediately, his head lowered, ears pinned back, his muscles coiled, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Emma's heart pounded. One of the men stepped forward, Vince Rourke, a name she had overheard from hushed conversations between her father and his fellow officers. Tall, broad-shouldered, with grizzled stubble and piercing dark eyes, Vince carried himself with the quiet menace of a man who had spent his life on the wrong side of the law. A deep scar ran from his right temple down to his jaw, a jagged mark that only added to his ruthless appearance. He wasn't just any biker, he was the leader of the Blood Vultures, and he hated David Carter. Emma didn't know the details, but she knew her father had put Vince in prison once. It hadn't lasted, but it had been enough to make things personal. And now Vince was standing in front of her. Titan's growl deepened. Vince smirked. Well, well, what do we have here? He muttered. his voice smooth but laced with something sharp and dangerous. Emma's fingers curled tighter around Titan's fur. She wasn't sure if she should run. But Titan was already making the decision for her, and Vince had no idea what kind of dog he was dealing with. Titan was not just any dog. He was a soldier, a machine trained for precision, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. But now, in the quiet town of Riverbend, he had become something far more important, a protector. Not to a police officer, not to a SWAT team, but to a 9-year-old girl named Emma Carter. Emma had always been different from other children. She was quiet, observant, and had an old soul that made her seem wiser than her years. She rarely spoke more than necessary, preferring to listen and watch rather than be the center of attention. Her honey-blonde hair was often tied back in a loose ponytail, strands always escaping to frame her small, thoughtful face. Her blue eyes held a sharp intelligence, a perceptiveness that often caught adults off guard. She wasn't loud or boisterous like other kids in her class. She didn't chase after things without thinking. She was cautious, deliberate, but fiercely independent. Growing up with just her father, Detective David Carter, Emma had learned early on that life was not always safe, that bad things happened even in small towns. She had seen the exhaustion on her father's face when he came home late, the tension in his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking. She knew Riverbend wasn't the same town it had been when she was younger. Then came Titan. When David had first brought him home, Emma had been both fascinated and wary. She had seen police dogs before, of course. She had even met some of her father's colleagues who worked with them, but Titan was different. He was large and imposing, his lean, muscular frame built for speed and power. His coat was a rich tan, accented with deep black around his ears and muzzle, and his amber eyes were piercing, too intelligent, too knowing. There was something in them that wasn't just obedience, it was pain, loss. Something Emma recognized in a way most people wouldn't. She had been told Titan was retired, but even at 9, she understood that wasn't the full truth. He wasn't retired. He was broken. She had overheard snippets of her father's conversations, how Titan had refused to work with a new handler after his partner, Officer John Lewis, was killed in action. How he had become unpredictable, shutting down during training, ignoring commands, how the department had decided he was too much of a risk and planned to put him down. David had refused to let that happen. At first, Titan had kept his distance from Emma. He followed David's commands, watched his surroundings with sharp awareness, but he never approached the girl. He was always on guard, as if waiting for something or someone who would never come back. Emma understood that feeling. One afternoon, a week after Titan had arrived, she found him sitting in the backyard, his posture rigid, his ears flicking at every small sound. He looked lost. Instead of calling him, Emma had simply sat down a few feet away. She didn't speak, didn't try to pet him. She just sat there quietly, staring up at the sky, as if she, too, were waiting for something that might never return. Titan had glanced at her, but he didn't move. "You're waiting for someone," she had said after a long silence. Titan didn't react, but his ears twitched. "You think it's your fault," she continued, her voice calm, sure. David, who had been watching from the porch, felt his breath hitch. Emma had never been told what happened to Titan. She didn't know the details of his past. And yet somehow she understood. Titan lowered his head slightly, his body losing some of its stiff tension. Emma didn't push. She didn't reach for him. She just let the silence settle between them. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Titan stood and took a step toward her. It was small, cautious, but it was the beginning of something new. He followed her from room to room, sitting by her feet when she did her homework, watching her carefully whenever she stepped outside. He walked beside her to the mailbox, lay by her bed at night, positioned himself between her and the door whenever she slept. David had seen plenty of K-9 bonds before, but this was different. This wasn't just training, wasn't just duty. It was something deeper. Emma never treated Titan like a pet. She didn't coddle him, didn't talk to him like he was a toy or a baby. She respected him, and in return, Titan trusted her. One night, a thunderstorm rolled through Riverbend. Emma had always been uneasy during storms, though she would never admit it out loud. She hated the unpredictability of the lightning, the way the wind howled against the windows. That night, she woke to the sound of heavy rain, thunder shaking the house. She sat up in bed, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. Then she felt it, a warm weight pressing against her leg. Titan was already there, lying beside her bed, his head resting near her feet. His eyes were open, alert but calm, as if to say, "I'm here. You're safe." Emma let out a small breath, her fingers moving to brush over his fur. She fell asleep that way, the storm raging outside, but Titan never moved from his spot. From that night on, Emma never felt truly alone. Titan wasn't just a former SWAT dog. He wasn't just a soldier with scars from a past life. Her protector, her silent guardian. And no matter what happened in Riverbend, he would never let anything happen to her. The alley was dark, lined with overflowing dumpsters and the faint scent of gasoline lingering in the damp air. The distant hum of traffic from the main street seemed a world away, leaving only the low rumble of motorcycle engines and the uneven breathing of the men standing before Emma Carter. Vince Rourke took a slow step forward, his boots scraping against the pavement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like a man who had spent years making people fear him. His leather jacket, adorned with the blood vulture's red skull insignia, stretched over his muscular frame, and the jagged scar running from his jaw to his left cheek made him look even more menacing. Years in and out of prison had hardened him, made him ruthless, but tonight he wasn't just here for business. He was here for revenge. David Carter had been the one to put him away 2 years ago, 2 long years in a cage while the world moved on without him. Now he was back, and the town of Riverbend was going to feel his wrath. And what better way to start than by sending Carter a message through his little girl? He smirked, cracking his knuckles. Well, well, what do we have here? Emma held her breath, clutching the grocery bag tightly against her chest. The plastic crinkled under her fingers, her small hands trembling slightly. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay still. She had always been good at observing things, and right now she was watching Titan. Titan had not moved. His ears were forward, his muscles tense, his amber eyes locked onto the men before them. He was calculating. The second man, Liam Fangs Garrison, sneered. He was tall and lanky, with greasy black hair that clung to his face. His nickname came from his uneven, yellowed teeth, which he bared in a wolfish grin whenever he wanted to intimidate someone. He had a habit of licking his lips, an unsettling tic that made people uneasy. "Kid, you really shouldn't be out this late. Dangerous town these days." The third man, Derek Rex Nolan, was the opposite of Fangs, built like a tank, his arms covered in faded tattoos, his bald head reflecting the dim streetlight. He cracked his knuckles, stepping forward slightly. "Let's make this quick, Vince. Just grab the kid, take the bag, and we're out." Vince lifted a hand to silence him, his eyes never leaving Emma. "Relax, we're just having a friendly chat," he said, his voice calm. But the way he moved, slow and deliberate, sent a chill down Emma's spine. Titan let out a low, rumbling growl. Emma felt it vibrate through his body, the sound deep and menacing. She had never heard him growl like that before, not even when he was playing rough with David in the backyard. This was different. This was a warning. Vince's eyes flickered toward the dog, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. He knew guard dogs. He had dealt with them before. Some were all bark, others were killers in fur. He couldn't tell which this one was. Fangs wasn't as cautious. He took a step closer, reaching toward Emma's bag. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Titan lunged. The world exploded into movement. One moment, Fangs was reaching for the bag. The next, Titan's powerful jaws clamped around his forearm with bone-crushing precision. The biker screamed, stumbling backward as Titan's teeth sank deeper, holding his grip like a steel trap. "Son of a... Get it off! Get it off!" Fangs howled, trying to shake Titan loose, But the dog was relentless. Rex reacted first, reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. Emma saw the motion and froze. The bright glare of the motorcycle's headlights burned into her vision, the deafening roar of the engines filling her ears. The sensory overload threatened to overwhelm her, but then her father's voice echoed in her mind. "If you're ever in danger, don't panic. Use your whistle. 3 short blows. Someone will come." Her hands trembled as she reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers curling around the small metal whistle her father had given her. Fangs was still screaming, his free hand flailing uselessly as Titan dragged him to the ground. Vince had taken a step back, his expression shifting from amusement to something colder. Rex's hand had closed around the gun, his fingers curling around the grip. Emma's instinct screamed at her to run. Instead, she raised the whistle to her lips and blew. 1. The shrill sound cut through the alley like a knife. 2. Vince flinched, snapping his gaze toward her. 3. The signal pierced the night. The moment of hesitation it caused was all Titan needed. With a powerful yank, he twisted his body, ripping Fang's arms sideways and sending the biker crashing onto the pavement. Rex raised his gun. Titan whipped around, his eyes locking onto the weapon. His growl deepened, a sound so primal it sent a flicker of doubt through Rex's expression. The dog wasn't afraid. In that instant, Vince made a decision. This wasn't worth it. David Carter would be coming, and if there was one thing he knew about cops like Carter, it was that they were ruthless when it came to their families. "Let's go," Vince barked. Rex hesitated. "I said, let's go." Vince turned sharply, striding toward his bike. Fangs, still groaning in pain, clutched his bleeding arm as he struggled to stand. Rex cast one last look at Titan before shoving his gun back into his waistband and following. Engines roared to life, the sound deafening in the narrow alley. Titan stood his ground, his stance solid, his breath steady, despite the adrenaline surging through his body. His job wasn't done yet. Emma still hadn't moved, her fingers still clutching the whistle, her breathing shallow. Titan turned to her, his amber eyes watching, waiting. Emma exhaled sharply, her heart still hammering against her ribs, and then she did something she had never done before. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around Titan's neck. The dog stiffened for half a second before relaxing, allowing the embrace. She buried her face in his fur, her small hands gripping him tightly. Titan had saved her, and as the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, she knew one thing for certain. He always would. Vince Rourke sat alone in the dimly lit back room of a rundown bar on the outskirts of Riverbend, his fingers drumming against the scarred wooden table. The Silver Stallion had always been a haunt for lowlifes, bikers, and those who had nowhere else to go. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the scent of stale beer clinging to every surface. Outside, the hum of motorcycles idling in the parking lot filled the night like a restless growl. Vince wasn't drinking. He rarely did, not because he had any moral reservations, but because he preferred to keep his head clear. He had learned long ago that alcohol made men sloppy, and Vince Rourke was never sloppy. He ran a hand over his jaw, feeling the rough edge of the scar that cut from his temple to his cheek. A reminder, a permanent brand of the day everything had gone to hell. Once he had been a cop, a damn good one too. Riverbend had been his town, and he had ruled it like a king from behind his badge. He knew which corners to turn a blind eye to, which small-time crooks to squeeze, which business owners would rather pay for protection than deal with real trouble. It had been a perfect balance, until David Carter ruined it. Carter had been the new blood, the clean-cut officer who actually believed in the badge. He had sniffed out Vince's operations quicker than expected, and before Vince knew it, internal affairs had come knocking. The investigation had started small, misplaced evidence, inconsistencies in reports, but it had spiraled fast. They found money, a lot of it, siphoned from drug busts, stolen from evidence lockups, handed off to informants who didn't exist, and when the trial came, David Carter had been the one to testify. Vince clenched his fists at the memory. He could still see Carter on the stand, his face unreadable, his voice steady as he delivered the words that sealed Vince's fate. No plea deal, no reduced sentence, just a badge stripped away, a prison sentence, and a lifetime of unfinished business. By the time he got out, Carter had moved on, had become a detective, had started playing the hero in a town that had already forgotten Vince Rourke. But Vince hadn't forgotten. And now he was going to take away the one thing Carter loved the most. The door creaked open, and Mike Spencer stepped inside. Mike was a man built from war. He had the lean, hardened frame of a soldier who had spent more time in combat zones than in civilian life. His short-cropped dark hair was beginning to grey at the temples, his sharp jawline covered in the shadow of unshaven stubble. His deep-set blue eyes, once full of purpose, were now dulled by exhaustion. PTSD had chewed him up and spat him out. Afghanistan had taken his sanity, and civilian life had taken his dignity. He had come home expecting parades, expecting some kind of return to normal, but there was nothing waiting for him except a bottle of painkillers and a VA system that buried him in red tape. He had drifted, lost, until Vince had found him. Vince had seen the anger, the brokenness, the potential for violence. He had recruited Mike into the Blood Vultures not because he needed another thug, but because he needed a soldier. Mike sat down across from Vince, rolling his shoulders like a man who had spent too many nights sleeping on concrete. "Word is, Carter's already sniffing around," he said, his voice rough. "That little stunt in the alley, it put him on high alert." Vince leaned back, smirking. "Good. Let him sweat." Mike didn't smile. He looked down at his calloused hands, flexing them absently. "You sure about this, Vince?" he asked after a long silence. Vince narrowed his eyes. "Since when do you ask questions?" Mike exhaled through his nose, glancing towards the bar outside. The laughter and shouting from the other gang members drifted through the door, but he wasn't paying attention to them. His mind was elsewhere, somewhere darker. "I signed up for this because you said we were taking the town back," Mike muttered. "Not—" He hesitated, rubbing his face. "Not kidnapping a cop's kid." Vince's smile disappeared. His expression hardened. "You think I don't see it?" he said coldly. "You think I don't know that you still try to play the good guy?" Mike looked away. Vince leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You don't have a home. You don't have a country anymore. You came back, and what did they do? They threw you in the gutter. You were a war hero, Mike. Now you're nothing." Mike clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. Vince sat back, satisfied. "That little girl," he continued. "She's leverage. Carter needs to learn that he doesn't run this town. We do." Mike stayed silent, his hands tightening into fists. Something in him twisted, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. He had lost count of how many people he had hurt since he left the war. He had been numb for so long that it had become easy to follow orders, easy to pull a trigger, easy to be something worse than he once fought against. But a kid, that was a line he had never crossed. He exhaled sharply, pushing himself up from the chair. "I need some air." Vince watched him go, his smirk returning. Mike Spencer was a soldier with a shattered conscience. But that conscience wasn't going to save him. Because once you were in with the Blood Vultures, you didn't get out. And soon, neither would Emma Carter. At the Carter household, David Carter paced the living room, his phone clutched in his hand. His dark brown hair was slightly disheveled, his sharp jawline tight with tension. The lines on his face were deeper than they had been a year ago, worn down by stress and sleepless nights. His ice-blue eyes, once full of quiet warmth, now held something darker, something dangerous. His daughter had almost been taken. That alone was enough to send his instincts into overdrive. Vince was back. He had known it was only a matter of time, but knowing didn't make it easier. He glanced toward the couch where Emma sat, Titan curled up beside her. She was quiet, too quiet. She had always been reserved, but now she seemed smaller, like she was folding into herself. David's chest tightened. He crouched down, resting a hand on her knee. "Emma," he said gently. She didn't look at him at first. Then, slowly, she raised her gaze. "They were going to take me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David swallowed hard. forcing himself to stay calm. "But they didn't," he said firmly. "Titan was there. You were brave." Emma hesitated, then reached out, gripping Titan's fur. David exhaled slowly, his mind already racing through his next move. This wasn't over, not even close. And if Vince wanted a war, then David Carter was ready to give him one. The night air in Riverbend felt heavier than usual, the tension pressing down like a weight that refused to lift. The dim glow of streetlights flickered over the cracked asphalt as the echoes of the struggle in the alley still lingered in the air. The sharp tang of gasoline and sweat mixed with the distant scent of rain, promising an impending storm, both in the skies above and in the streets below. Emma Carter's heart pounded against her ribs as she sprinted toward the main road, her small legs pushing with every ounce of strength she had. She could still hear the growls and scuffles behind her. Titan was fighting. The sound of heavy boots pounding pavement made her stomach twist in fear. "Get her!" Vince Rorke's voice sliced through the night. Two of his men lunged forward, blocking her path before she could reach the open street. Emma skidded to a halt, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but there was nowhere left to go. Behind her, Titan let out a savage snarl, sinking his teeth deeper into the arm of the biker he had tackled. The man howled in agony, thrashing against the unrelenting grip of the Malinois' powerful jaws. But Titan wasn't letting go, not until Emma was safe. Vince stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a man in his early 40s, hardened by years of violence and betrayal. His broad shoulders and powerful frame made him an imposing figure, but it was the cold, calculating gleam in his sharp brown eyes that made him truly dangerous. He wasn't just a thug, he was a strategist, a predator who knew how to pick apart his prey. And right now, his prey was Emma Carter. Titan finally released his victim, the man collapsing to the ground with a pained groan. The dog immediately spun, planting himself between Emma and Vince. His stance was rigid, his ears forward, his teeth bared. The moonlight caught the sleek black and tan of his fur, his muscles coiled like a loaded spring, ready to launch. Vince exhaled sharply, reaching into his jacket. The glint of metal caught Titan's eye. A gun. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. Titan growled deeper, his body lowering as if preparing to lunge, but before he could, a hand shot out, grabbing Vince's arm. "Don't!" Mike Spencer's voice was quiet, but it cut through the air with the weight of a man standing at the edge of a precipice. Vince's head snapped toward him, his lips curling in irritation. "What the hell are you doing, Spencer?" Mike stood firm, his 6-foot frame still carrying the rigid posture of the soldier he used to be. His sharp blue eyes were clouded with exhaustion, his jaw tight with something unreadable. He looked like a man caught between two lives, one he wanted to escape and one that refused to let him go. "We weren't supposed to hurt the kid," Mike said, his voice steady. "We scare Carter, we make him back off. But this is something else." Vince's fingers tightened around the grip of his gun. "Back off, Mike." Mike didn't move. "She's 9 years old." Vince scoffed. "So?" Mike exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "This isn't a war zone, Vince. This isn't some insurgent mission where we take hostages. She's a little girl." Vince's eyes flashed. "This isn't your damn decision." Mike clenched his jaw. He had done a lot of bad things in his life, but this wasn't something he could stomach. "Put the gun away," Mike said. For a moment, Vince didn't react. The air between them stretched tight, the weight of unspoken words pressing down. Then Vince smirked. "You're growing soft, soldier," he sneered. Mike's fists curled, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he took another step forward, placing himself between Vince and Emma. A low rumble came from Titan's throat. He stayed close to Emma, but his sharp eyes flicked between the men, his instincts reading the situation. Then, in the distance, a new sound. Sirens. Vince stiffened, his head snapping up. The wail of police sirens cut through the night, growing louder with every second. The distant hum of radios crackled to life. The cops were coming. One of Vince's men stumbled out from the alley, gripping his injured arm. "Vince, we gotta go!" Vince hissed a curse under his breath, his mind racing. He had underestimated the girl. He hadn't expected her to blow the whistle, hadn't expected anyone to call for help so quickly. Time was up. He shoved the gun back into his jacket and turned on his heel. "We're leaving." Mike hesitated, glancing at Emma once more. Then, without another word, he followed. Titan didn't move until the roar of motorcycles faded into the night. Emma stood frozen, her chest rising and falling in short, panicked breaths. She didn't even realize she was trembling until Titan nudged her leg, his warm fur pressing against her skin. Slowly, she sank down beside him, burying her face in his thick coat. Then, "Emma!" The voice snapped through the air like a gunshot. Detective David Carter. He was running toward her, his broad frame moving faster than she had ever seen him run before. His sharp blue eyes, always steady, were wide with panic. Emma barely had time to react before her father dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" His voice was rough, his hands checking her over, his grip tight like he was afraid she might disappear. Emma shook her head, her fingers still curled into Titan's fur. "Titan saved me," she whispered. David turned his gaze to the Malinois, his expression darkening as he took in the way Titan stood, strong but tense, his body still coiled from the fight. Then David looked back toward the alley. Vince was gone, but this wasn't over, not by a long shot. David pressed a kiss to Emma's hair before rising to his feet, his jaw tightening. He had spent years chasing criminals. Now it was personal. The night in Riverbend was far from over. The sound of police sirens grew louder, their sharp wails cutting through the tension like a blade. The flashing red and blue lights painted the dark streets in pulses of color, bouncing off the damp pavement. Emma Carter stood frozen, her small frame trembling as Titan, her loyal protector, remained at her side, his body tense with unwavering vigilance. Detective David Carter moved swiftly, his sharp blue eyes scanning the chaotic scene. He was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the build of a man who had spent his life in law enforcement. His short, dark brown hair was slightly disheveled from running, and a faint scar ran along his jawline, a reminder of an old case gone wrong. Despite his normally composed demeanor, his face was a mask of controlled fury. His daughter had been in danger, and the man responsible, Vince Rourke, was still out there. The alley was filled with movement. Officers in dark uniforms flooded in, their weapons drawn, their voices firm as they called out commands. Some tended to the injured, others secured the area. The biker Titan had attacked lay groaning on the ground, his arm limp from the force of the Malinois' jaws. But Vince was nowhere to be seen. David's heart pounded as he knelt beside Emma, his hands cupping her face. "Are you hurt?" Emma shook her head quickly, but her grip on Titan's fur remained tight. "He was going to hurt me, Dad." Titan stopped him. David's gaze flickered to the Malinois, and he exhaled a slow breath. "Good boy," he murmured, reaching out to briefly run his hand over the dog's head. Titan didn't move. His focus was still locked on the shadows beyond the flashing lights, his instinct screaming that the fight wasn't over. Then a sharp movement from the darkness. "Freeze!" an officer barked, but it was too late. Vince Rourke lunged from behind a stack of crates, moving with the speed and precision of a man who had spent years navigating dangerous situations. He was tall, muscular, with dark hair peppered with grey and eyes like flint, cold, calculating, and brimming with a thirst for vengeance. His rugged face was hardened by years of anger and resentment, but in that moment, all he cared about was one thing: making David Carter suffer. And he had the perfect way to do it. Before anyone could react, Vince grabbed Emma, yanking her back against his chest. One arm wrapped tightly around her small frame, while his other hand reached into his jacket. The metallic click of a knife echoed in the alley. Titan snarled, his entire body coiling with explosive energy. David's blood ran cold. "Let her go, Vince," he said, his voice low, even, controlled, Vince let out a short, bitter laugh. "You really think I'm just going to do that, Carter?" he sneered, his grip tightening on Emma. "After everything you took from me?" Emma whimpered, struggling against his hold. "Dad!" David took a slow step forward, his hands slightly raised. "This isn't the way, Vince." Vince's jaw clenched. "No? Then what is? Watching you take everything from me while I rot in the gutter?" His voice dripped with bitterness. "I lost my badge, my life. You testified against me, Carter, and now I take from you." Titan growled deep in his throat, inching forward, his sharp eyes locked onto the blade in Vince's hand. Vince barely noticed the dog. He was too blinded by rage, too caught up in the fire burning through his veins. His grip on Emma remained firm, but his attention flickered to David for a fraction of a second. It was all Titan needed. With the speed of a bullet, the Malinois launched forward, a blur of muscle and power. His jaws clamped down on Vince's wrist, sinking deep into flesh and tendons. Vince howled in pain, his grip on the knife loosening. Emma stumbled free, falling backward onto the pavement as Titan wrenched Vince's arm. Blood dripped onto the ground, but the dog didn't let go. "Stand down! Let go of the girl!" an officer barked, his gun trained on Vince. For a split second the fight seemed over, but Vince wasn't done yet. With a strangled snarl, he twisted, his free hand reaching down to his boot. The flash of a second knife, hidden, small but deadly, caught the light. Titan lunged again, but he wasn't fast enough this time. The blade sliced into his hind leg. A sharp yelp of pain tore from Titan's throat, but he refused to back down. Even as his blood darkened the pavement beneath him, he positioned himself in front of Emma, standing firm. A shot rang out. Vince's body jerked as a bullet struck the ground inches from his feet. "Drop the weapon now!" a commanding voice rang out. Sergeant Ethan Walker had arrived. Walker was in his late 40s, a veteran officer with a no-nonsense demeanor. Tall, stocky, with graying blonde hair and piercing green eyes, he was the kind of man who had seen it all and took no nonsense from anyone. His uniform was neatly pressed, his stance unwavering, his gun locked on Vince with absolute precision. Vince's breath came in ragged bursts. He was bleeding, surrounded, outnumbered. He knew it was over. Slowly, his fingers uncurled from the knife, and it clattered to the ground. Titan stood his ground, his breathing heavy, his wound bleeding freely, but he never took his eyes off the man who had threatened his girl. "Cuff him," Walker ordered. Two officers moved in swiftly, yanking Vince's arms behind his back. He hissed as the handcuffs snapped shut, his face contorted with pain and fury. David wasted no time. He was at Emma's side in an instant, pulling her into his arms. Titan finally collapsed onto his side, exhaustion and blood loss taking their toll. Emma let out a strangled sob. "Titan!" David turned, his gut clenching as he saw the deep wound on the Malinois' leg. "We need a medic," he called out. An officer rushed over, kneeling beside the dog. "We got an emergency vet on standby." David pressed his forehead to Emma's hair, holding her close as relief and fear tangled inside him. Titan had saved her, but now it was their turn to save him. As Vince was hauled toward a police vehicle, he shot one last glare at David. "This isn't over, Carter," he spat. David met his gaze with unwavering steel. "Oh, it is," he said coldly. Vince was shoved into the back of the squad car, his reign of terror finally over. David knelt beside Titan, brushing his fingers gently over the dog's blood-matted fur. Titan blinked up at him, his breathing slow but steady. "You're a damn hero," David whispered. Emma wiped her tears and placed a trembling hand on Titan's head. "You saved me," she whispered. "Now we'll save you." As the night finally began to settle, the sirens faded, and the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. Titan had given everything to protect his girl, and now they would fight for him. The emergency veterinary clinic in Riverbend was a stark, sterile place, its fluorescent lights casting harsh reflections off the linoleum floor. The air smelled of antiseptic and the faint metallic scent of blood. Officers and paramedics had rushed Titan inside, and now in the dimly lit waiting room, Emma Carter sat curled up on a plastic chair, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her small frame trembling from exhaustion and worry. Titan had been wheeled away behind double doors, disappearing into the depths of the clinic. Emma had tried to follow, but a nurse had gently stopped her, kneeling down to meet her wide, tear-filled eyes. "We need to take care of him now, sweetheart," the nurse had said softly. She was in her early 40s, with tired eyes and greying brown hair tied back in a ponytail. Her name tag read Dr. Evelyn Brooks, one of the most experienced veterinarians in town. She had a reputation for being calm under pressure, having spent years treating police dogs, injured strays, and even the occasional farm animal from the outskirts of Riverbend. But despite her hardened experience, she had spoken to Emma with kindness, sensing the depth of the little girl's bond with her dog. Emma had nodded stiffly, but the separation had been unbearable. Now she sat beside her father, Detective David Carter, who hadn't left her side since they had arrived. His strong hands rested on his knees, his face etched with fatigue and frustration. He kept his focus on the hallway ahead, as if willing the doors to open and bring good news.
"Dad,"
Emma whispered, her voice hoarse from crying.
"He'll be okay, right?"
David glanced at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "Dr. Brooks is the best, honey," he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Titan's strong. He'll fight." Emma didn't answer. She just hugged herself tighter. Across the waiting room, Sergeant Ethan Walker paced near the vending machine, his burly frame casting long shadows against the walls. He was in his late 40s, broad-chested with a thick moustache that had long since gone grey. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. He had served in Riverbend's police force for over 2 decades, witnessing the town's slow decay as crime festered in its underbelly. Tonight had been a turning point. Walker's sharp green eyes scanned the room, landing on Mike Spencer, the former soldier who had once been Vince Rourke's reluctant recruit. Mike sat slumped in a chair, his hands clasped together, his jaw clenched. Mike was in his early 30s, lean and wiry, with close-cropped dark hair and a scar running along his right cheek, a souvenir from his time in Afghanistan. His brown eyes were sunken from sleepless nights and past regrets, but tonight something different flickered in them. Resolve. Mike had made a choice. "I'll testify," he had told Walker on the way here. "I'll give you everything on Vince, the blood vultures, the smuggling operation, everything." Walker had studied him carefully. "You're willing to turn on your own crew?" Mike had let out a bitter laugh. "They were never my crew. Just another bad decision." He had exhaled, running a hand through his short hair. "I know what I've done. I know I'm not innocent in all this, but I can help bring Vince down. I want out, Walker, and I want a real shot at fixing my life." Walker had considered this for a long moment before nodding. "You do this right, and the DA might work with you." Now, in the waiting room, Mike could feel Walker's gaze burning into him. The sergeant wasn't a man who gave second chances lightly, but he also wasn't the type to waste them. Before anyone could say another word, the double doors swung open. Dr. Brooks stepped out, pulling off her surgical gloves, her face a mask of exhaustion. The waiting room fell silent. Emma jumped to her feet. "Titan?" The vet sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "He's stable, but it was close," she said. "The knife cut deeper than we thought. He lost a lot of blood, and there was some muscle damage, but—" She paused, glancing at Emma's wide, anxious eyes. "He made it through surgery. He's strong." Emma let out a strangled breath, a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "Can I see him?" Dr. Brooks hesitated. "He's still unconscious, but yes, just for a little while." David stood, nodding his thanks before placing a gentle hand on Emma's back, guiding her forward. They walked down the hallway, past the sterile smell of disinfectants and medical equipment, until they reached a recovery room where Titan lay on a padded mat. He looked smaller somehow, curled up with an IV in his front leg, his breathing slow but steady. His normally sleek fur was ruffled and matted with dried blood, a fresh bandage wrapped around his hind leg where the knife had cut deep. Emma knelt beside him, her small hands trembling as she placed them on his head. "Titan," she whispered, "you saved me. Now it's my turn to save you." Titan's ear twitched just barely at the sound of her voice. His eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest second, his dark brown eyes met hers. Emma smiled through her tears. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. Behind them, David and Walker stood by the doorway, watching in silence. "Tell me about this smuggling operation," David said, finally turning to Mike. Mike exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. Vince had connections, deep ones. He wasn't just running drugs, he was smuggling weapons. "I know the next drop-off location." Walker crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "And you're willing to go on record with this?" Mike met his gaze. "Yes." David exchanged a glance with Walker. This was bigger than any of them had realized. For the first time in a long while, Riverbend had a real shot at taking the blood vultures down for good. But for now, David only had one priority, his daughter. He turned his gaze back to Emma, who was still whispering to Titan, her fingers gently stroking his fur. Titan had saved her life. Now it was their turn to return the favor. The sun had barely risen over Riverbend, casting a golden glow across the quiet town. The streets, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now carried the scent of hope, fragile but present. At the Carter household, a soft breeze rustled the curtains of Emma's bedroom, where she lay curled up on her bed, Titan's large frame stretched beside her on a soft blanket. His breaths were slow but steady, a comforting rhythm that had lulled her to sleep for the first time in days. Titan had survived. It had taken 6 long hours of surgery, multiple transfusions, and an exhausting night at the clinic, but he had pulled through. His once powerful hind leg, the same one that had carried him through so many dangerous missions, would never be the same again. The injury had been too deep, the muscle damage too severe. The doctors had warned them that he might never regain his full strength, that his days of running at full speed were over. Emma had only smiled at them, her small fingers gently tracing the bandage wrapped around his leg. "You don't need to chase bad guys anymore," she had whispered to him that night. "You just need to stay with me." Titan's ear had flicked in response, his eyes fluttering open for just a second before he had drifted back into a peaceful sleep. Downstairs, David Carter stood in the kitchen, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. His face looked older today, the lines around his mouth deeper, the weight of the past week pressing down on him like an invisible force. For the first time in years, Riverbend had found justice. Vince Rourke, the man who had haunted his career, had finally been taken down. He glanced at the newspaper spread across the counter, the bold headline blaring, "Blood Vultures Leader Sentenced to Life, Riverbend Finally Free." David exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb against his temple. It wasn't just about Vince. It was about the countless victims, the businesses that had paid for their so-called protection, the kids who had been lured into a world they could never escape from. It was about the corruption Vince had tried to spread within the police force, about the lives he had ruined. And yet, in the end, it had been a 9-year-old girl and her dog who had stood up to him. The door creaked open, and Mike Spencer stepped inside, his posture relaxed, but his eyes scanning the house like the soldier he once was. Mike had changed in just a few days. The tension in his jaw had eased, the dark circles under his eyes were fading, replaced with something that almost resembled peace. He had testified against Vince and the blood vultures, providing crucial evidence that tore their entire operation apart. Thanks to him, multiple arrests had been made, and the streets of Riverbend had finally started to feel safe again. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man rebuilding his future. David glanced at him and nodded. "Coffee?" Mike smirked. "Haven't slept in 2 days. I could use a cup." David poured him one and slid it across the table. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. "You did the right thing," David finally said. Mike let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Took me long enough." He exhaled and stared into his cup. "You know, for a long time, I thought I was too far gone, that there was no coming back from the things I did." David didn't say anything. Mike met his gaze. "But then I saw that dog throw himself in front of Emma without hesitation. No second thoughts, no fear, just pure instinct to protect." He swallowed hard. "That's when I realized it was never too late to do the right thing." A soft whimper interrupted their conversation. They both turned toward the stairs as Emma appeared in the doorway, her messy blonde hair falling over her shoulders, her oversized hoodie making her look even smaller than she was. Titan hobbled beside her, his movements slow, but his tail wagging ever so slightly. The sight of him standing on his own was enough to bring a tightness to David's throat. "He insisted on coming down," Emma said, her voice still thick with sleep. "I think he wanted to say hi." Mike crouched down, extending a hand toward Titan. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "Tougher than all of us, aren't you?" Titan sniffed his fingers before nudging Mike's palm with his nose, accepting the gesture. Emma plopped down at the table, rubbing her eyes. "So, now that the bad guys are gone, does this mean Riverbend is safe again?" David leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "For now," he said honestly. "But bad people always find new ways to come back. It's up to us to stop them." Emma nodded, considering his words. Then she looked down at Titan. "Well, they'll have to go through us first." David chuckled, ruffling her hair. "That's my girl." Outside, the morning light spilled through the windows, painting Riverbend in a way it hadn't been in years, bright, full of promise. A town rebuilt piece by piece, a family stronger than ever, and a dog, once a warrior, now a survivor. Titan stretched out beside Emma, letting out a satisfied sigh as she rested her head against his side. He had fought his last battle, but his purpose had never been clearer. He wasn't just a police dog. He wasn't just a protector. He was Emma's guardian, and that was all that mattered.